I'm the host now. Okay, guys, I'm so sorry. So today we will continue with what we were doing. Um, the past few days we've been looking at the speaking section, and we've already seen most of the questions in the speaking section. We're just missing the last question, question number 4 of the speaking section. And that's what we're going to be doing today. Remember that in the speaking section, you have a total of 4 questions, question 1, 2, 3, and 4. And today we'll be looking at the last one, task number 4. Okay? You guys have any questions before we start? No questions? Okay, guys. So task number 4 is actually very similar to task number 3. You guys will see. What is the difference between task 3 and task 4? Basically, the format. The content is quite similar, but the format is different. So in the last question of the speaking section, you will only have to listen to a lecture. So this lecture is around 1.5 minutes or maybe 2, and it's a university lecture, right? So it's an academic class about a certain topic, and you have to just listen to it. Then you will get the question that will ask you to summarize the points made in the lecture, and you will have 20 seconds to prepare and 1 minute to speak. All right, so that is the difference, right? In task number 3, you have to both read and then hear the audio. But in this one, you will just be listening to the lecture. So you just listen to the lecture, you get the question, you get 20 seconds to prepare and 1 minute to speak. So is that okay? Do you guys have any questions in terms of the format of the task? No questions? Okay, guys. So honestly, I don't want to get into too many details. I want to start right off with an example, okay? And we are going to use that example to see the theory, okay? But let's first hear an example. So I'm gonna play the lecture. If you please take notes. Yes, Alexander? Alexander?
Excuse me, miss, and the template for this question is the same as the
Oh no,
question 3?
it's not the same. We will see the template in a little. It's a different template because the structure is a little bit different. Although the content is similar, the structure is different. So you guys will see. First, let's listen to this lecture, and then we'll talk about the structure, okay? I want you guys to take notes. Take notes of everything that you consider important. All right? So let's see.
Listen to part of a lecture in a business class.
If a consumer has to choose between 2 products, what determines the choice? Assume that someone, a purchaser, is choosing between 2 products that cost the same, okay? If people have a choice between 2 identically priced products, which one will they choose? They choose the one they think is of higher quality, of course. But what does it mean for a product to be a high-quality product? Well, business analysts usually speak of 2 major factors of quality. One factor is reliability, and the other is what we call features. So reliability. What's reliability? Well, a product is reliable if it works the way we expect it to work, if it can go a reasonable amount of time without needing repairs. If a product, a car for example, doesn't work the way it should and needs repairs too soon, we say it's unreliable. So product reliability means basically the absence of defects or problems that you weren't expecting. It used to be that when people thought about product quality, they thought mainly about reliability. Today, it's different. People do still care about reliability, don't get me wrong. It's just that manufacturing standards are now so high that We'll take cars, for example, today. Today's cars are very reliable. So reliability is important, but it's not going to be the deciding factor. So if reliability isn't the deciding factor anymore, what is? Features. All those extras, the things a product has that aren't really necessary, but that make it easier to use or that make it cool. For example, new cars today are loaded with features like electric windows, sunroofs, air conditioning, stereos, and so forth. When people are comparing products today, they look at features because reliability is pretty much equal across the board. And that's why manufacturers include so many features in their products.
Using points and examples from the lecture, explain the two major factors of product quality and how their role in consumer decision-making has changed.
Okay, guys. So that was the lecture. And I want you all to tell me a little bit about what it was about. What was it about? What was the topic of the lecture?
Factors to determine the quality of a product.
Exactly. I love that. Factors that determine the quality of a product, right? Hang on, I'm gonna make this bigger. Perfect. I love that. So yes, the lecture then is about factors that determine the quality of a product. Now, in the lecture, you might have noticed that before getting into the details, before getting into what the actual factors are, the professor gave a short introduction, right? In the first like 20, 15 seconds, you had a short introduction. In that introduction is where the professor mentions the topic, right? The professor says, so we're going to be talking today about the factors that determine the quality of a product, right? That's something that you got in the introduction. But of course, that isn't the only thing that you got in the introduction. Maybe you had other things as well, right? But the most important part is to understand in the introduction what the topic is. In this case, this is perfect. Now, so then the professor breaks down the topic, right? The topic is product quality and the factors that determine it. But then the professor breaks it down, divides the lecture. Into how many subtopics does the professor divide the lecture? Into two, exactly. And those two subtopics are actually the two factors that were mentioned, right? What was the first subtopic, the first factor?
Reliability.
Exactly that, reliability. And when the professor talks about the first factor, before getting into any details, she gives a short definition of the word reliability, right? Or her short explanation of what it is. So do you guys remember what reliability was?
Like a guarantee, a work expected of the product without repair.
Exactly. So it's like a guarantee that the product will work, right? We can write that the product will work the way that it's expected, the way it's expected. And as you said, that it won't need repairs, right? It won't need repairs, at least not soon. Great. So that is reliability. So in the first subtopic of the lecture, the professor presents the subtopic and then explains it a little bit. Maybe gives a definition, maybe just explains it in some way. And then I don't know if you guys noticed, but the professor gives an example of that subtopic, right? So the professor gives an example of reliability. Do you guys remember what the example was? Reliability? What was the example? Nobody remembers? The example was about cars, right? So the professor gives the example of cars and says that a car is reliable when it doesn't need repairs too soon and when it works the way that you would expect it to work, right? So basically, that's when a car is reliable. Yes, do you guys agree with me? Anything else that was mentioned there? So look at the difference, right, between the subtopic. The subtopic is when the professor talks about things in general. So the professor in the subtopic talks about products in general, right? But then in the example, the professor talks about one specific product, cars, right? So there's a difference between talking about something in general terms versus giving examples about specific products in this case, right? Now, what about the second subtopic? What was the second factor that determines quality of the product? Do you guys remember? What was the second factor?
That's the features.
Exact features. And what are features? Features are
Extra, an extra addition of for the product.
exactly. So these are things that are not necessary, right? So these are like additional things, additional characteristics of a product that make the product easier to use or that make it look nice or that make it maybe look cool, right? Make it appealing for the consumer. And what are the examples or the example that the professor gives about features? Sorry. What's the example here? The second example?
For the car, electric windows.
Electric windows, sunroof, stereos, right? I don't know. Air conditioning. So the professor gives those examples, right, of features. Again, in the subtopic, the professor talks about features in general, right? Says, well, features are extra characteristics, extra things. But in the example, the professor talks about what specific things in one specific example of cars, right? Electric windows, sunroofs, stereos, air conditioning. So this is the lecture, right? That is what it was like. Now, of course, that wasn't the only, those weren't the only things that were mentioned. The professor also gives some additional details. So the professor, I think that as an additional detail, talks about how consumers have switched the focus or have switched what the determining or the major factor when choosing a product is. So I think that in the past, consumers used to focus a lot on reliability. That was the determining the main factor when choosing a product, right? That it was reliable. But now, because of the fact that most of the time reliability is kind of the same among products, so people already expect a product to be reliable, and then they are looking more at features, right? And that has become the major factor now. So those will be the additional details, right? The switch from reliability being the main factor to features being the main factor now. But what I want you guys to know is that just like this example that we've analyzed the structure, you have a short introduction, you have the first subtopic, you have an example of the first subtopic, you have the second subtopic and a second example. That structure will be exactly the same in every question that you could get for task number 4. Okay, so it will always be like this. The structure will always be the same. All right, you will always have the intro, two subtopics, and two examples. So you know what to expect already. Based on this, then you have to be paying attention for catching these specific elements and taking your notes properly, right? You will always have to find the topic, the two subtopics, and the two examples. Is that okay? Do you guys see the structure? Do you have any questions? No? Okay, thank you. So, based on this, that means that you should be taking your notes in that order, right? I recommend that you try to put some indentation so that you make the differentiation between the layers, right? So the topic, subtopic 1, example 1, subtopic 2, and example 2. So that's something that you guys can do when you're taking notes. Now, something else that I wanted to say. In terms of the topic, in terms of what the general topic in the entire lecture is, I don't suggest that you guys take notes during the introduction. So don't take any notes when the professor is giving the introduction. What I suggest that you guys do is that you use what you have in the question. Because after you hear the lecture, then the question will appear in your screen and you will see and hear it. So what I suggest that you guys do is use what you have in the question. In the question, you will always have a good summary of the topic. In this case, they say, using points and examples from the lecture, explain the two major factors of product quality and how their role in consumer decision making has changed. So you will always have the topic in the question and use the tools that you have, use the question. So why am I saying this? What happens is many times the introduction of the lecture can be a little bit long and a little bit confusing. So sometimes it isn't clear what the topic is, or maybe it's hard to find a way to summarize the topic in a few words, which you will have to do for this task. So my suggestion is look at the question, always read the question, and when you're speaking, you will have to mention what you have here, the two major factors of product quality, okay? Which is the same as we said, right? This is what Alexander said. Two factors that determine the quality of a product. That is the same as saying two major factors of product quality, right? So use what you have in the question. Is that also clear?
Yes,
Okay.
please.
Now, technically, you would have 20 seconds to prepare. It's the same as all of the preparation times in the speaking section. You have to see what you can do there. You could either practice, you could either organize your notes, circle a few things, cross out a few other things, depending on what works better. But finally, during the 1 minute that you have to speak, this is what you guys will do. So let's see the template for this task. This is the template. Remember that you get 60 seconds or 1 minute for this question, right? To answer this question. So what are you gonna do during this 1 minute? First, you're gonna organize it like this. The 10 first seconds, that means that you start at 60, right? When the clock hits 50, you should have already given the introduction. First, you need a short introduction that is supposed to be at most 10 seconds. So in the introduction, you're gonna basically talk about the topic in general. And this is why I told you to use what you have in the question. Basically, I'm telling you to read from the question because it will be on your screen. So you read, you say, the lecture discusses the two major factors of product quality, right? I just read what I had in the question, the two major factors of product quality. That is the topic, right? So you just read what you have in the question. And that shouldn't be more than 10 seconds, okay? Then after the introduction, you will still have 50 seconds for the body of your response, and you have to organize it like this. 25 seconds for the first subtopic and the first example, and 25 others like the resting seconds for the second subtopic and the second example. Okay? So you have to use reporting verbs in the simple present. You have to refer to the professor. You have to use some transition words, and then everything is what you say in the as the content, right? So for example, in this case, you could say first, the professor explains reliability, which is you define it, right? And then you say for instance, and you give the example. With cars, this and this and that. And then once you have said everything about the first topic and example, you go to the second one and you have 25 seconds to complete the response. You have your transition. Another thing, and this is the same as we were saying before, although this is not really necessary, but make sure that you always write down the pronoun of the professor. In this case, it was a female professor, so we're gonna say she. So we say then she goes on to explain features, which are the extra characteristics and so forth. To illustrate, she gives the example of cars, and then you explain the example. Okay? So that is a template. That's how you use it. Is it okay? Do you guys have questions about this template? No questions? Okay, guys. So I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna try answering the question so that you can see a sample response, or you can hear a sample response. And then we'll practice, okay? But let's see. Okay, try to see mostly how I organize my time, okay, and how I accommodate my response to the time that I have. You could also maybe pay attention to what details I skip, what information I do mention, and everything else. Let's see. The lecture discusses the two major factors of product quality and their role in consumer decision making. First, the professor explains reliability, which is defined as the absence of defects or when a product actually works the way that the consumer would expect it to work. For instance, the professor gives the example of cars. With cars, she says that a car is said to be reliable when it works the way that it's expected, when it doesn't need to be repaired too soon after buying the car. Then the professor goes on to explain features, which are all those extra characteristics that a product has that although they are not necessary, they make the product easier to use or then make them appealing for the consumer. To illustrate, she continues with the example of cars and she mentions a few features like electric windows, sunroof, stereos, air conditioning, among others. Right? So that is an example of the response in this case. Basically, I tried to do everything I told you. I tried to organize my time like that. 10 seconds in the introduction, 25 for the first subtopic and first example, another 25 for the second one. I did use the template, although I accommodated it to the response as well, right? So for example, in the second part, I didn't say to illustrate, she gives the example of. I said she continues with the example of cars, right? Because I noticed that it was the same example as in the first. So you could do those, accommodations when necessary. That's okay. And the important thing, honestly, is that you keep the structure, that you do use these transition words, that you use the reporting verbs, and that you mention the important information, right? So what do you think, Alexander? Do you have questions now?
No, it's clear, Miss.
All right. Now, before we get into some practice, I wanted to say too that the topics that you get for this question are actually the same as the ones you had for task number 3. So you will still have psychology, biology, and business as your main topics. And then additionally, like 10% of the time, you could get something different, right? Something related to the arts, to history, and so forth. So we have done by business one, right? Business topic. And I don't know if you were able to see, but vocabulary is important, right? Because I was trying to use the correct and the appropriate vocabulary. I wasn't saying in how people decide what product to buy or decide what thing to buy, right? I was saying how about consumers and how they decide what product to buy. So those words like consumers, product, quality, reliability, those are business words, which is important, which is why it's important to have some vocabulary related to these topics. Right? Same thing goes for biology. So you probably have to use words like predator, species, habitats, I don't know. And same thing in psychology, right? We'll have to use a few words like bias or maybe behavior. I don't know. So it's important to use those words. I guess that's it. I don't know if I can give you some more tips. Basically, don't waste time in the introduction. That's usually the number one mistake students make. You shouldn't be spending more than 10 seconds. And if you can do it in fewer seconds, that'd be even better. Or don't waste time in additional details. If there are some other things that the professor mentions as additional information, don't focus on that. The important things are always going to be the two subtopics and the two examples. You have to take notes, that's for sure. I don't think you could answer the question that well if you don't take notes because you have specific wording, right? Like reliability and features, which is hard to remember if you don't have notes. You gotta use connectors, transitions, reporting verbs. So basically just follow the template here. Skip irrelevant details if you don't consider that some details are important or that they add too much to the ideas, then skip them. Paraphrase a little bit if you can, although this is usually a given because you have to explain it in your own words, right? Most of the time. Practice, obviously, and practice with somebody that can maybe give you feedback. And if not, if you don't have anybody to practice with, you can always record your responses and see how you're doing. If you're going to take the test in a test center, make sure that you practice in a noisy room because when you take it in a test center, there's likely going to be other people there and that can be distracting. So practice with distractions. And obviously read the question. This is something that a lot of students skip and it is useful. It's plenty of useful when you read the question because you can use that in your introduction, right? As we said. So those would be the tips that I can give you in this case. Is it okay? Do you have questions, Alexander, about this?
No, it's clear, Miss.
Okay. So we've done business. Now let's now do psychology, and then we'll do biology.
Maybe, Miss, where I can find this type of vocabulary or type of letter with this vocabulary.
Vocabulary. Well, I don't know if you were in class, but I sent this PDF with a word list of, a vocabulary for the TOEFL test, speaking and writing sections of the TOEFL test. So I can send you that document. Hang on a second. But I don't honestly recommend that you try to memorize the words, and like study them with memory or flashcards or anything. I don't think that's the correct way because that way maybe you'll memorize the words and their meaning, but then it's hard for you to actually use those words when you're speaking, and it's hard to know when or how to use them properly. So my suggestion would it's always going to be try to read about those topics, try to hear podcasts or watch videos about those topics, as I was saying for task 3, right? Maybe for biology, if you want to improve on your biology vocabulary, watch National Geographic videos, or maybe read about science topics. Or if you want to improve on your psychology vocabulary, maybe you can watch some TED Talks or listen to psychology podcasts. For business, there are plenty of podcasts that you can hear. So that is always the best way of learning vocabulary with context, when reading by reading and listening. Because otherwise you could memorize the words, but it's hard for you to implement them in your speaking. But I'm gonna send you anyways the document. Hang on a second. All right. Hmm. Okay, sorry for the delay. So I just sent you the link to this document.
Thank you, Miss.
Sure. Any other question? Okay. So we'll do the next question. Yeah. This is psychology. So let's see.
Now listen to part of a lecture in a psychology class.
When people are in difficult situations, sometimes they experience feelings of helplessness or psychological pain. So what do? They unconsciously use strategies called defense mechanisms to protect themselves psychologically from their painful emotions. Let's say a woman has a pet dog. She's had this dog for a long time, and he's kept her company and guarded her for years, but one day he runs away. This woman looks everywhere and asks other people if they've seen her dog, but she just can't find him. Now, she feels helpless and sad because she misses her dog, so she'll unconsciously find ways to deal with her painful feelings. One defense mechanism she might use is fantasy. With fantasy, the woman uses her imagination. So instead of just feeling helpless and sad about her lost dog, she invents a happy story in her mind. She might imagine that a nice family found him and feeds him, and that he's really happy with them. She'll picture the dog playing, running around, having fun. Because of this fantasy, she doesn't have to feel sad about her dog running away. It's a fantasy. It's not real, but it keeps her pain away. Another defense mechanism she might use is what we call sublimation. Sublimation is different from fantasy because sublimation isn't about pretending. It's about turning negative emotions into something useful, practical. So the woman might start a dog training school. That way, by training dogs, perhaps she can help prevent other people's dogs from running away like hers did. In other words, with sublimation as a defense mechanism, the woman redirects her negative feelings about losing her dog into a positive, constructive activity.
Okay, guys. Now the question says, using points and examples from the talk, describe the two defense mechanisms mentioned by the professor. We'll now have 20 seconds to prepare your response. Okay. So, do you want to try, Alexander?
Yes, miss, but I can't hear all the conversation. I try.
Okay, no problem. Try with what you have. You may go ahead now.
The lecture discusses some of defense mechanisms of humans when they have a hard situation. First, the professor explained the fantasy that consists in the imagination or imagining some not real situation to contrast the the real situation. For instance, if one for instance, if you lose the dog, you can imagine the dog stay with you, and you imagine that situation. Then she goes on to explain to sublimation, and that to illustrate, she gives example to emphasize the negative emotions to.
Okay. Okay, Alexander, no problem. You were a little bit nervous, but you did fine. It's just a matter, the problem that you have was mostly the time, but that's just practice, no problem. The good thing is that you were able to understand the structure. You got both subtopics, fantasy and sublimation. You understood what both of them were about. So imagining a happy situation to deal with the pain, and sublimation, turning your negative feelings into something productive, right? And you also got the example about the lost dog. What I would suggest is obviously try to summarize a little bit more the ideas, especially in the first subtopic. You know, sometimes you will have more than just one definition for each subtopic. I think in this case you have more than one, but always try to go with one sentence. Give only one sentence for the first subtopic. So first, the professor explains fantasy, which is imagining a happy situation to deal with your pain, right? So it's only one sentence. And then you go with the other one, which is the example, for instance. And when you talk about the example, try to mention it the same way that the professor did. So in this case, she was talking about one woman who lost her dog, right? So it was a little bit more specific. You tried to generalize the idea. You said, for instance, if you lose your dog, so try not to do that. Always like talk about the example in the same way the professor did. So you could say, for instance, the professor mentions that if a woman has lost her dog, she might imagine that the dog is that a nice family has found the dog and that he's happy and so forth. So, but I am keeping the same structure of the example, right? A woman that has lost her dog. So careful with those things and just practice summarizing information and it will be great. And remember in the first part, the first verb is the verb discuss, right? So the lecture discusses. Careful with the pronunciation. Is it okay?
Okay, miss.
All right. Now let's do a biology one. Let's see what we have.
Excuse me, miss, I didn't hear you.
Okay, we're gonna do a biology one now. I'm gonna play the lecture. Please take notes too. Identify the two topics and the two examples. It's
Listen to part of a lecture in a marine biology class.
A lot of plants and animals live near the surface of the ocean, and that means there's a lot of food near the surface because there are lots of plants and animals to eat. But if you go down to the deepest parts of the ocean, it's cold and dark, and there's not a lot living down there, so food is very scarce. So organisms that live down at these great depths have developed special adaptations to help them survive in this environment where food is so hard to find. For example, many deep-sea organisms have body features that enable them to eat prey that are larger than themselves. A good example, there's a species of eel that has an enormous mouth and a large stomach that's capable of expanding. And these unusual features allow this eel to eat prey larger than itself. That's a big advantage, because if the eel eats something big, that's a lot of food, a lot of nutrition. So the eel can go for quite a while before it has to find food again. Another helpful adaptation in some deep-sea organisms is the ability to generate light. And some organisms use that light to help them capture food. For example, there's a kind of fish called the anglerfish, and on its head, this fish has a little structure that produces light, that glows in the dark. This little structure, this little light, is positioned close to the fish's mouth. Other fish are attracted to this light. They think it's something small they can eat, so they swim straight toward it, and that brings them close enough for the anglerfish to capture them and eat them.
now the question says, using the examples of the eel and anglerfish, explain two types of adaptations that help animals survive in the deepest parts of the ocean. Now you will have 20 seconds to prepare your response. Okay. So please start speaking now. I'm gonna put the template, sorry. There you go.
The lecture discusses how the condition of the deep ocean could be make adaptation in some species of fishes. First, the professor explains the some body modification could be appear in some fishes, like For instance, a large stomach or some most addition features. Then she goes on the, she gives another example for, I don't know. Then she goes on to explain that the ability to generate light, like to fish. To illustrate, she gives example of.
Okay. So usually biology is always a little bit more complicated, but we're gonna talk about the structure. So in this case, and it's always like this with biology, honestly, you always have as the subtopics, you won't have names anymore. So these are not concepts like the ones you had for psychology and business, right? Like reliability or fantasy. You don't have that type of names of concepts anymore. But instead you have like a phrase as a subtopic, right? Like in this case, it was adaptations that help animals catch food. So you had the first adaptation, which is what you were mentioning, body features, right? So some animals have changed their body features. So some have large stomachs or large mouths, right? And then the examples are gonna be the specific animals. Now, in this case, it's not always going to be like this, but in this case, you have the names of the two animals in the question. So remember to always use what you have in the question. In the question, they say, using the examples of the eel, this was the first example, and the anglerfish, this was the second, explain the two types of adaptations, right? The first type was the body features, like having a large stomach or a large mouth, body features. And the second type, as you said, was the ability to generate light, right? That was great, the ability to generate light. So based on that, that's kind of how you have to go. You don't need to explain too much when you have biology. The important thing is that you mention the subtopics and the examples. For the introduction, use what you have in the question, right? So in the question, they said, explain two types of adaptations that help animals survive in the deepest parts of the ocean. So in your introduction, you could say something like that. You could say, the lecture discusses two adaptations that help animals in the ocean survive. First, the professor explains that some animals have body features that enable them to eat a lot of prey. For instance, and then you talk about the specific animal, right? The eel is an animal that has a large stomach and a large mouth, and this allows the eel to have to storage a lot of food, right? And then you say, then she goes on to explain that other animals have the ability to generate light to catch prey. To illustrate, she gives the example of the anglerfish, which has a little light in its mouth or close to its mouth, and this light attracts other animals that the anglerfish can later eat. So I'm not giving too many explanations, but what I am really doing is mentioning the two topics and the two examples. Usually the examples are self-explanatory. You don't have to, like you did in the past with psychology and business topics, we had a definition here, right? But you don't have that anymore. You just say the professor explains that some animals have the ability to generate light. Only the subtopic, without any explanation. And then you go directly to the example. So for instance, the anglerfish, and then you explain the example, but not the subtopic. Okay, so it's a matter of practice too. Don't worry if you didn't make it on time today. Tomorrow we'll practice with more questions and you'll see that it's just about practice. Do you have questions about this one?
No, it's clear.
Okay, Alexander. Any questions then at all about what we did today?
No, it's okay.
Okay. Then basically this is it. This is task number 4. Tomorrow we'll be practicing. We have done 3 topics now, but tomorrow we'll continue with those 3 and we'll try to do the other ones as well. So we're gonna see if we have something about art and so forth. But the structure, the good thing is that the structure is always the same. So again, it's just honestly the skill that you need here for this task is being able to summarizing information, because the lecture is 2 or 3 minutes long, but you have to summarize all that in one. So it's about compacting the information as much as you can and classifying relevant versus irrelevant details. And also taking good notes. Because if in your notes you have too much information, you will want to mention all of that. So we're going to see that tomorrow. We're going to practice those skills tomorrow.
Okay, Miss.
Okay, Alexander, please, before you go, don't forget today's daily survey. And I'll be seeing you tomorrow.
Bye, Miss.